two creation stories in Genesis, a deepening mystery of faith. What if the foundation of the creation story you've always believed in isn't as unshakable as you thought? Brace yourself for a revelation that has the power to challenge centuries of faith and tradition. The Bible contains not one, but two conflicting accounts of creation. And these aren't mere variations in perspective, they're profound contradictions, hidden in plain sight, waiting to be uncovered. From our earliest days in Sunday school, we're told the Bible is a flawless, unified narrative, a divinely inspired account of how everything began. But this assumption begins to unravel the moment we hold Genesis 1 and Genesis 2 side by side. These stories don't just diverge in tone and detail, they present fundamentally different portrayals of God, humanity, and the act of creation itself. How do we reconcile this? Can we? Genesis 1: Order and Majesty. In the first chapter of Genesis, creation unfolds like a symphony, guided by a transcendent composer. God speaks and the universe obeys. Day by day, he brings light from darkness, separates sky from sea, and breathes life into the earth. It's a methodical, majestic process that crescendos with the simultaneous creation of man and woman on the sixth day. Here, humanity is introduced as the climax of creation, both male and female, equal in purpose and dignity, bearing God's image. This account exudes divine authority and precision. God is distant, unapproachable, and omnipotent, shaping the cosmos with mere words. It's a narrative of power, control, and cosmic harmony. But the second chapter of Genesis offers a starkly different vision. Genesis 2: Intimacy and Contradiction. Flip the page, and the tone shifts dramatically. The God of Genesis 2 steps down from the heavens and enters the dust. This isn't the same majestic creator of Genesis 1. This is a hands-on craftsman, sculpting man from clay, planting a garden, and physically breathing life into his creation. Humanity is no longer created in a single act of divine speech. Instead, man comes first, formed in solitude. Woman appears only later, crafted from Adam's rib, an act seemingly driven by God's realization that Adam needed a companion. The differences don't end there. The sequence of events is fundamentally altered. In Genesis 1, plants and animals precede humanity. In Genesis 2, they follow Adam's creation. The style, purpose, and even the portrayal of God diverge so sharply that these accounts feel like the work of two distinct authors with radically different visions. How can these two narratives coexist in the same sacred text? If the Bible is the unerring word of God, why do these accounts feel irreconcilable? And perhaps the most unsettling question of all, what does this reveal about the nature of God? In Genesis 1, God is sovereign and all-knowing, creating with effortless command. Yet in Genesis 2, he appears responsive, even reactive, forming animals as companions for Adam before deciding they aren't sufficient. The omnipotent creator of Genesis 1 suddenly seems to be experimenting, as though discovering humanity's needs as he goes. Does this imply a limitation in divine foresight, or is there a deeper message we've failed to grasp? The differences between these stories aren't just stylistic, they reflect divergent theological visions. Genesis 1 emphasizes equality. Man and woman, created together, share a unified purpose. Genesis 2 introduces hierarchy. Adam is formed first, and Eve is created to complement him. This shift has shaped centuries of debate over gender roles, authority, and the nature of relationships, with profound consequences for theology and society alike. But the contradictions go even deeper. Genesis 1 portrays a God of cosmic order, reigning over a universe of his design. Genesis 2 reveals a God intimately involved in the lives of his creations, shaping them by hand, dwelling in their midst. These are not minor differences. They represent two distinct ways of understanding who God is and how he relates to humanity. Scholars have long grappled with these contradictions, offering a theory that reshapes how we view the Bible itself. The prevailing view is that the Hebrew Bible is a tapestry woven from multiple sources, each representing distinct traditions, histories, and theological perspectives. Genesis 1 is often attributed to the priestly source, emphasizing ritual, structure, and divine transcendence. Genesis 2, in contrast, reflects the Yahweh's tradition, which focuses on personal relationships and God's immanence. But here's the real bombshell. If Genesis has multiple versions of creation, what else have we been missing? What else is hiding between the lines? Because, let me tell you, Genesis isn't even the first creation story in history. Long before the Hebrew Bible was written, ancient civilizations were telling their own epic tales about how the world began. And some of these stories, well, they sound eerily similar to the stories we find in Genesis. Take the Enuma Elish, for example. This ancient Mesopotamian creation myth predates Genesis by centuries. It tells the story of a cosmic battle between the gods, with the world being created out of the body of a defeated chaos serpent named Tiamat. Sound familiar? It's not the same as Genesis, but the parallels are hard to ignore. There's a separation of waters, the emergence of land, and a divine being bringing order out of chaos. It makes you wonder, did the writers of Genesis borrow from these earlier stories? Did they take these ancient myths and give them a monotheistic twist? Scholars have been debating this for centuries, and the truth is, we may never know for sure. But what we do know is that the Bible, like any other ancient text, didn't emerge in a vacuum. It was shaped by the world around it, by the cultures and stories that came before. And when you start to look at Genesis in that light, you realize just how complex and mysterious this ancient book really is. It gets better. The Egyptians had their own creation myths too, like the one where the god Adam rises from the primordial waters and starts creating the world. Again, we see this theme of creation emerging from chaos, waters, darkness, and then, boom, life appears. And guess what? The Greeks also had a similar thing going on in their theogony with Gaia and chaos. All these stories share common threads: primordial waters, gods or forces shaping the world, and chaos being tamed into order. So why are all these ancient stories important for understanding Genesis? Because it shows us something crucial. Genesis isn't telling us something radically new. It's part of this much larger tradition of creation myths that existed for centuries across the ancient world. But while the other stories often involved multiple gods fighting and struggling to control chaos, Genesis took a different approach. It streamlined the narrative. Instead of a pantheon of gods at war, you have one God who speaks things into existence, no battle necessary. And that's the genius of Genesis. It took elements from older stories, chaos, creation, order, but presented it in a radically simplified, monotheistic framework. It's like the biblical writers looked at all the myths floating around at the time and said, all right, we're going to do this differently. Our God doesn't need to fight a dragon. He's just that powerful. Now, don't get me wrong. I'm not saying the writers of Genesis were copying these other myths word for word, but the evidence is hard to deny. These cultures were connected, they traded ideas, and their stories evolved together. When you realize this, Genesis stops being just a religious text and starts looking like a piece of an even bigger puzzle, a global story about humanity trying to figure out where it all began. And here's the thing. These myths didn't just shape Genesis. They shaped how ancient people saw the world, how they understood their place in the universe. If you lived in ancient Mesopotamia, you didn't see creation as this peaceful, orderly event. You saw it as the aftermath of a brutal, cosmic battle. The world you lived in was carved out of chaos, and that idea shaped everything, from how you viewed the gods to how you understood your own life. So here's the big question. Why did the authors of Genesis break away from that tradition of violence and chaos? Was it a response to those older myths? A way of saying, our God isn't like that. He's not part of the cosmic struggle. He's above it. All right, now that we've unpacked the roots of the Genesis creation stories and how they tie into ancient myths, Let's talk about something even more controversial, the Sumerians and the Anunnaki. Yeah, this one's gonna blow your mind. We're not just talking about some ancient myth here. We're talking about one of the oldest known civilizations, Sumer, located in what's now modern-day Iraq. The Sumerians had their own story of creation, but this one's got a twist that raises some seriously uncomfortable questions about the nature of human existence. In Sumerian mythology, the gods weren't sitting peacefully in heaven like in Genesis. They were called the Anunnaki, and they were supposedly beings from the sky who played a direct role in creating humans. But here's where it gets wild. The Sumerians believed that the Anunnaki created humans as a workforce, basically to be slaves. Yeah, you heard that right. According to the ancient texts, the Anunnaki were overburdened with their tasks, so they decided to make humans to do the hard labor. They didn't just snap their fingers, though. The texts say they mold humans from clay and divine essence. Sound familiar? If you're starting to see some parallels with the Genesis story of God forming Adam from the dust of the earth, you're not alone. But in the Sumerian version, humans weren't created to rule over the earth. They were created to serve the gods. Now here's where things take an even crazier turn. Some modern theorists, especially those who dabble in ancient astronaut theories, believe that the Anunnaki might not have been just mythological gods. They suggest that the Anunnaki were actually extraterrestrials who came to Earth and genetically engineered humanity. Yep, we're talking alien intervention in the creation of mankind. According to this theory, the Anunnaki didn't just come from the heavens metaphorically. They literally came from another planet and engineered humans to be their labor force. Now, before you roll your eyes, let's break it down. The Sumerians were an advanced civilization. They had writing, mathematics, astronomy, and architecture far ahead of their time. Where did all this knowledge come from? Could it really have been passed down from the East Sky gods? That's what proponents of the ancient astronaut theory argue. But whether or not you believe in the extraterrestrial angle, the real point is this. The Sumerian story of creation is one of the oldest, and it shares some unsettling similarities with later stories like Genesis. Both talk about beings who shape humans from the earth, but in Sumer, the gods are practical. They need workers, not spiritual beings. What if the Anunnaki story is the real original? What if the narrative of gods creating humans to serve them predates the more sanitized version in Genesis? If we're honest, the Genesis account feels a little cleaner, doesn't it? God creates humans and gives them dominion over the earth. But what if that's just the PR-friendly version of a much darker origin story, one where humans were created not to rule, but to serve? Think about it. In Genesis, humans are given free will and placed in a paradise. But in Sumerian mythology, humans were created as laborers, and the gods used them for their own benefit. It's almost like Genesis is the version that gives us dignity, while the Sumerian account strips it away, revealing a much more utilitarian origin. Remember that these Sumerian stories are thousands of years older than the biblical texts. So when you read Genesis, you've got to wonder, how much of that story is a retelling or reworking of much older myths, like those of the Anunnaki? Why does this matter? Because if the Sumerians' creation story influenced the Bible, and if the Anunnaki myth is even partly true, whether as gods, aliens, or something else entirely, it changes how we see ourselves. Are we the rulers of this world as Genesis tells us, or were we once slaves to gods from the sky? Now that we've tackled the Sumerians and their version of human creation, where humans were basically created to serve the gods, it sets us up for the next big twist, the story of Eden. Because let's be honest, the story of Adam and Eve in Genesis seems a little too simple on the surface. They eat from the tree of knowledge, get kicked out. End of story, right? Wrong. Here's where things get really interesting. We've all heard the mainstream interpretation. The serpent is Satan, tempting Eve, leading her and Adam into sin. But what if I told you that the serpent wasn't the villain? In fact, in many ancient cultures, serpents are symbols of wisdom, knowledge, and transformation. So instead of this being a straightforward tale of disobedience, what if it's actually a story about liberation? God places Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden, surrounded by everything they could ever want, but forbids them from eating from one specific tree, the tree of knowledge of good and evil. Why? Why give humans free will, the ability to choose, and then say, don't touch that? It almost feels like a setup. The tree is right there, in plain sight, and it holds the key to understanding good and evil. Yet, they're not supposed to touch it. Enter the serpent. Here's where the traditional story gets flipped on its head. In Gnostic traditions, which are ancient texts and beliefs that challenged early Christian views, the serpent is seen as a liberator, not a deceiver. According to these writings, the serpent's role wasn't to trick Eve, but to free her and Adam from ignorance. The tree of knowledge was forbidden because God wanted to keep humanity in a state of blind obedience. The serpent, in this reading, is offering you the chance to wake up, to see the world for what it truly is. And what's even more fascinating, Gnostic texts portray God not as a benevolent, all-powerful creator, but as a lesser deity, a kind of tyrant, someone who wants to control humanity, to keep them in a state of ignorance. The real enemy, in their eyes, wasn't the serpent. It was the god of the garden who wanted to keep humans like obedient pets, blissfully unaware of the world around them. Now, I know this sounds controversial, but think about it. After Adam and Eve eat the fruit, what happens? They don't die, like God said they would. Instead, their eyes are opened. They gain knowledge. They become aware of their nakedness. They understand right and wrong. In other words, they become fully human. Isn't that what separates us from animals, our ability to reason, to understand morality? So maybe the serpent wasn't offering death at all. Maybe the serpent was offering freedom. And here's where it connects to what we've already discussed. Remember how in the Sumerian creation myth, humans were created to serve the gods? What if Eden was the same thing? What if Adam and Eve were placed in the garden, not to rule over it, but to remain in a state of servitude, unaware of their potential? The forbidden fruit wasn't just a random test of obedience. It was the key to breaking free from the garden, from a paradise that was actually more like a prison of ignorance. The serpent gives Eve a choice: remain in a state of blissful ignorance or take the risk of knowledge and all the consequences that come with it. Eve's decision wasn't a sin, it was an act of courage. She chose knowledge. She chose to wake up. And yeah, it came with a cost. Adam and Eve were banished from Eden, but they also gained something far more valuable: their autonomy, their ability to think for themselves. We've been talking about creation, but what if the story of how the universe was created isn't as simple as God spoke and it happened? What if there's a lot more going on behind the scenes? Here's something a lot of people don't realize. In ancient Jewish mysticism, specifically in the Kabbalah, there's an idea that God didn't create the universe alone. Instead, creation was a collaborative process involving multiple aspects of the divine, known as the Sephirot. And we're not just talking about a few angels lending a hand here. We're talking about different emanations of God's own essence working together to shape reality. According to Kabbalistic teachings, God's true essence, what they call the Ein Sof, is beyond comprehension, completely infinite. It's so vast that it can't interact with the physical world directly. So to create the universe, God essentially had to split himself into these different divine attributes, each one representing a different aspect of his power. These attributes, or Sephirot, work together in harmony and tension to shape the cosmos. Now, this idea throws a wrench into the traditional God spoke and boom, it's done version of creation that we get in Genesis. In this Kabbalistic view, creation wasn't a smooth process. It was full of complexity, with different parts of the divine essence pulling in different directions. Think of it as a cosmic balancing act where divine energy was being channeled through the Sephirot to bring order out of chaos, And it gets even weirder. In the Kabbalistic tradition, they talk about a concept called Simsum, which basically means that before the universe could be created, God had to contract himself to pull back his infinite presence to make space for the physical world to exist. So the universe isn't just the result of some all-powerful command. It's the product of divine tension, of God both withdrawing and emanating his power in ways that allow the material world to take form. Let's be real, this is a far cry from the straightforward creation narrative we've been taught. The idea of a fragmented, multifaceted God shaping the universe through different emanations. It's a little more complicated, but also way more fascinating. So why does this matter? It changes how we think about God's role in creation. In Genesis, God is all-knowing, all-powerful, and everything happens exactly as he wants it to. But in the Kabbalistic view, creation is more like a process, almost like God is experimenting with different ways of manifesting his essence in the physical world. It's not chaos like in the Mesopotamian myths, but it's also not as clean and perfect as the Genesis account suggests. And here's the kicker. It means that God himself is in some way involved in a dynamic process. He's not this distant figure who creates with the snap of his fingers. He's involved, even to the point of self-limitation, making room for a world where things can unfold, where humans can exist, and where free will actually has meaning. This connects perfectly with what we've already talked about. If the serpent in Eden wasn't just tempting humans into disobedience, but was offering them a chance at knowledge, this whole idea of a fragmented, dynamic God fits right in. The universe itself wasn't created to be static. It was created through tension and balance, and that tension trickles down to the choices humans have to make. You could argue that God's withdrawal to make space for the universe is mirrored in the way humans were given the ability to choose, to think, to rebel. It's almost like the act of creation itself was about introducing complexity and freedom into the world. And isn't that what the whole Adam and Eve story is about? Humans choosing to embrace knowledge, even if it meant breaking free from God's direct control. But here's where it gets even crazier. Some interpretations of Kabbalistic thought suggest that the creation of the universe wasn't perfect. According to these teachings, there were previous worlds that God tried to create, but they couldn't hold together, they fell apart. This is known as the shattering of the vessels. The current universe we live in? It's the one that's stuck, but it's still full of imperfection, and that's part of why humanity exists, to help restore balance to the divine plan. So, in a way, creation is still happening. The universe isn't finished, and neither are we. But let's switch gears for a minute and focus on a figure who's been completely erased from most mainstream versions of the Bible, someone who challenges everything we think we know about the story of humanity's beginning, Lilith. You might be wondering, wait, Lilith? Isn't it just Adam and Eve in Genesis? Well, here's the thing. Before Eve, there was another woman, Lilith, and her story changes the whole dynamic of what we think went down in Eden. First, let's get this straight. Lilith is not in the canonical Bible. You won't find her name mentioned in Genesis. But in Jewish folklore and other ancient texts, Lilith was said to be Adam's first wife. Yeah, that's right, before Eve. And here's where things get interesting. Lilith was created from the same clay as Adam. They were equals from the start. No rib, no secondary creation, just Adam and Lilith, both formed at the same time. Sounds fair, right? But this is where things take a turn. Lilith, being equal to Adam, didn't feel the need to submit to him. She wasn't about to play the role of the obedient, submissive wife. So what does she do? She leaves. That's right, she walks away from Eden, from Adam, from everything. And here's where her story disappears from most retellings. But let's dig into what this really means. Lilith wasn't just rejecting Adam. She was rejecting the entire system that placed her beneath him. In a sense, Lilith represents rebellion, autonomy, and female independence, all things that, quite frankly, didn't sit well in the patriarchal world that wrote and rewrote these texts. Her story was so dangerous to the status quo that later religious traditions had to bury it, demonize her, and replace her with Eve, the more compliant, obedient woman who comes from Adam's rib. But let's pause and think about this. If Lilith was Adam's equal, why did the story need to be rewritten? Why did the focus shift to Eve, created from Adam's body and thus somehow subordinate to him? Could it be that Lilith's refusal to submit posed too much of a threat to the idea of male dominance, and so her story had to be wiped from the official narrative? Now, remember how we talked about the idea of balance and tension in creation from the Kabbalah in the last section? This concept of duality fits right in here. Lilith and Eve represent two opposing forces. Lilith, the symbol of autonomy and defiance, and Eve, the symbol of compliance and traditional femininity. In some ways, it's as if humanity needed both figures: Lilith, the one who breaks free, and Eve, the one who accepts the role she's given, for the story to move forward. Later texts, particularly in medieval Jewish mysticism, depict Lilith as something darker, almost demonic. She's painted as a seducer, a killer of infants, a figure to be feared. But why? What's the real reason Lilith had to be cast out not just from Eden, but from the entire narrative? Some say it's because she represents a challenge to the very structure of divine order. If Lilith, a being created as Adam's equal, could reject her place and walk away, that implies humans have the power to resist the roles they're assigned, not just by society, but by God. That's a terrifying thought for any system based on obedience. By demonizing Lilith, the writers of later texts were sending a clear message: defy the system and you become the enemy. They couldn't allow the story of a woman who stood up to divine authority and rejected her role to become a symbol of empowerment, so they twisted her into a villain. But here's the thing: even though her story was erased from the mainstream, Lilith's legacy never truly disappeared. Over time, she became a symbol of female empowerment and independence. In modern feminist readings of the story, Lilith is seen as the ultimate rebel against patriarchal control. She refused to be anyone's subordinate, not Adam's, not God's. And for that, she was punished, erased, demonized. Which raises the question, what would the world look like if Lilith had stayed? If she and Adam had truly been equals from the beginning, how different would the story of humanity be? Maybe Eden wasn't just a setup for the fall. It was a stage for a power struggle, one that ended with Lilith being forced out to make room for Eve, the woman who would follow the rules. Now that we've uncovered Lilith's story and seen how it challenges the traditional narrative, let's talk about something even more mind-blowing. What if this world wasn't the first one God created? Yep, you heard that right. There's a theory, rooted in ancient Jewish mysticism, that suggests the world we live in isn't the first version of creation. In fact, according to Kabbalistic teachings, God tried to create the universe multiple times before, and those earlier worlds? They didn't work out. They were imperfect, they fell apart, they were destroyed. It's called the Shattering of the Vessels, a cosmic event where previous creations couldn't contain the divine light, and they basically collapsed under the weight of their own imperfection. Think about that for a second. What if we're living in the latest attempt at creation? What if the world we know today is just one version in a series of cosmic experiments? And if that's the case, then creation wasn't just a one-time event. It's an ongoing process, with each iteration coming closer to something sustainable, something that works. Now, this isn't just some far-off, mystical idea. It actually fits perfectly with everything we've been talking about. Remember how we discussed the tension between chaos and order, knowledge and ignorance, freedom and obedience? Those tensions aren't just themes in the stories, they're built into the fabric of creation itself. The idea that God had to try again multiple times reflects the reality that creation is messy, imperfect, and full of challenges. And it's not just creation that's ongoing. Humanity's role in this process is ongoing too. According to Kabbalistic thought, we are part of the process of repairing the world, something called Tikkun Olam. We're here to help fix what's broken, to balance the forces of chaos and order, to restore what was shattered during the creation process. In other words, humanity isn't just an accident of creation. We're essential to its completion. If we tie this back to the stories of Adam, Eve, and Lilith, it starts to make even more sense. The fall wasn't the end of the story. It was part of the process. Adam and Eve stepping out of Eden wasn't just a punishment. It was the next phase of creation. Humanity had to leave the garden, had to face the challenges of the world, because that's how the universe moves forward. Through choice, through struggle, through learning. And here's the kicker. If God had to create and destroy worlds before, and if humanity is part of this ongoing process of repairing the universe, it raises an interesting question. What's next? Are we living in the final, perfected version of creation, or is there more to come? Could there be another stage, another leap forward that we haven't even imagined yet? The fact that creation is described as an ongoing process gives us a new way to look at the world around us. Instead of thinking of life as a static, finished product, we can see it as something fluid, evolving, something that we are directly involved in shaping. And that's powerful. It means we're not just passengers in this cosmic story, we're participants with the ability to influence what happens next. So as we wrap up this journey through the creation stories, from the ancient myths to the hidden narratives of Lilith, from the cosmic forces of the Sephirat to the shattering of the vessels, here's what it all comes down to. Creation is not a finished story. It's still unfolding. The world we live in is imperfect, sure, but it's also full of potential. And just like Adam, Eve, and even Lilith, we have the power to choose, to act, to shape the next chapter of creation. Creation is not a static event etched in stone. It is a dynamic, ongoing process marked by tension, complexity, and human participation. The Genesis accounts, far from offering a singular, unchanging narrative, invite us to wrestle with the profound mysteries of existence. Through the lens of ancient myths, Jewish mysticism, and the hidden stories of figures like Lilith, we see that creation is not merely about the origins of the world, but about the unfolding of human potential. Each contradiction, each untold story, challenges us to rethink our place in the cosmos. Are we passive recipients of divine will, or are we co-creators in a universe still evolving, still incomplete? As we look at the shattered vessels of Kabbalistic lore, the rebellious legacy of Lilith, and the bold choices of Adam and Eve, one truth becomes clear: creation was never meant to end with Eden. It was meant to grow, to transform, and to challenge. It is a story still being written, and we humanity hold the pen. So as you leave this exploration of Genesis and beyond, ask yourself, what role will you play in this ever-unfolding story of creation? Will you accept the world as it is, or will you step into the tension, embrace the complexity, and shape what comes next? The choice, like the fruit in Eden, is yours.